Okay, good morning, Janice. I have Janice Munemitsu, the author of this compelling novel called The Kindness of Color. So I'm really honored to be able to uh, greet you, Janice. Would you like to kind of give the folks a brief introduction? And I have a lot of questions about your book, about you, and even starting with your name. Munemitsu, I understand means source of light or rooted in light. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Ron, for having me. I'm a Sansei, born in California, so native Californian. My grandfather came from Japan to the U.S., the Los Angeles area in 1916. He was 17 years old and he came as a farm worker. Our name is very unusual here in the US, but especially it's also unusual in Japan. On the couple of times I've been to Japan, several people have stopped me and said, "Oh, you have a very unusual Japanese name, even in Japan." And
Mm.
so um, the kanji is kind of unusual. And I had a friend who is a native Japanese and who loves to look at kanji names, help me to kind of decipher what it means. And so that is what we came up with because hikaru is one of the kanji, and that is light or lightness. And so I hope with my name and the story, the true story that we have in The Kindness of Color, my hope is that it will bring light and be inspirational to many people.
Well, that seems like one of those providential things that the source of light or rooted in light is so spiritual in a
Yeah.
way. I love that connection.
Well,
So
I felt like it was a divine connection for sure. You
So
know,
tell me how the divine connection continued, even in the inspiration and motivation that I know you've shared with me Bob Goff's influence on you and so forth, but would you kind of reiterate how you even happened to be motivated to A, write the book and B, to see where it's gone since you've written and published it?
I'm the reluctant author. I never intended to write a book. But the former superintendent of Orange County Department of Education, Dr. Al Mijares, and his chief academic officer, Jeff Hittenberger, they both found out about the story, and they said, "You've got to write this down. This has to be a book." And they had a lot more vision for this. I just thought, sure, for the Department of Ed, I'll just write it down and they can put it on their website or whatever. But as it went through, um, I found more and more details, and the book got a little bit longer. And it covers the story of two families. I mean, the interest is a lot in rooted in the Mendez versus Westminster, Mendez et al. Versus Westminster et al. Federal court case that led to the desegregation of California public schools in 1947. But it all has the background is the history of the Japanese Americans before and during World War II. Um, so it's a multicultural community story about when decisions are made, um, poor decisions that are made on the government's part with Executive Order 9066 to incarcerate 125,000 um, innocent Japanese Americans unjustly. And then also in the case of the Mendez, their children were forced to go to Mexican schools because although they were citizens as well, they, because of their Mexican name and they were children of immigrants, they were forced to go to Mexican schools. So it's kind of a story of a true story of what can the community do in the midst of adversity. Um, And it's not that we won't have to suffer. It's not that we won't have to persevere, but how, in what ways, can a community support each other in the midst of adversity?
Well, your narrative that intertwines the history of the two families, how did you happen to find historically those connections between the two families? How were they interrelated with your family?
Um, Growing up, I didn't know much about this story except for every once in a while, my dad or mom would say, "Oh, yeah, that's the family that my dad leased the farm to during World War II." And it was always in reference to articles that of this Mendez et al. Versus Westminster school desegregation case, or a junior high school was named after the Mendez family. And I remember, oh, yeah, that's the family that uh, on my dad's side leased the farm to during World War II. So that's kind of what I knew, and nothing really came about it, except for then, almost 23 years ago, I got a call from an independent producer who said, "Are you the Munemitsus who used to live in Westminster?" And I said, "Well, my dad did." I said, "I grew up in Garden Grove, but yes, we farmed in Westminster." And she said, "I want to meet you, and I'm doing a documentary on the Mendez et al. Families.
Hmm.
There were five families: Mendez, Palomino, Ramirez, Estrada, and Guzman, and I'd love you to come." And so at that time, my father had already passed, and I don't have many regrets, but I had wished my father was still alive then. He would have loved to have
Hmm.
met the Mendez family or been reconnected. But my aunt, one of my aunts, lived locally, so I kind of conned her into going with me. She said she didn't want to go, and I said, "Okay, I'll go." And then she goes, "Well, then I'll go with you." Yeah. So we went, and it was like we were meeting, old family. The connection
Hmm.
was so strong with the Mendez family. And that's where I started to learn more and more about the case. So that was about 22 years ago. And then through that time, there would be different events honoring this case. And I would be, and sometimes my aunt, we would be the only Japanese Americans amidst a lot of Latino or whites, and they're like, "Oh, that must be the Japanese family." So I really started to learn. And then the more I got into art history, when my mother died, I went through all the paperwork in our farm office, and then I found the leases that Gonzalo and my dad had signed in 1940 4 and 45. And so
Hmm.
that got me deeper into this story. So a lot of the quote unquote research, a lot of it is Sylvia's verbal story from her mother that she got the family history from. And that's included in the book. And then the family history of what led up to the lease and what happened after the lease. So um, much of our story is based on actual family records or remembrances. And then I also had to add a lot of context. I've gotten many comments from people who did not grow up in California, do not know California history, do not know about the Spanish background and that and all of that. And so I tried to include other history to give context of what was going on or what happened, what California was before, our more contemporary age, um, to put it all into context. So,
Well, the Hispanic and the Japanese Americans, um, as we know, have both faced bias and prejudice, which is kind of the underlying things that you talk about in your book. How did you ever talk with any of the Mendez family about their experience with bias and prejudice and compare it to your own family's experiences with prejudices?
yes, I have. Her parents, Sylvia Gonzalo and Felicitas, her parents, mother and father, have passed. And so I never met them. But through Sylvia, her brother Gonzalo Jr., and her brother Jerome, we've shared some stories. And so I think what's interesting when I talk to people, they think racism mostly is a black and white issue in American history.
Mhm.
They don't realize that many people, including some European immigrants, when they first came to America, there was a lot of discrimination as well. And so I think it's quite shocking to a lot of people to hear these stories um, of Mexicans being discriminated against in the early 1900s, Japanese being discriminated against, and Chinese immigrants in the late 1800s, and not realizing kind of the foundations of this on the West Coast. So there's quite a few different stories, and they're in some ways very similar, even though context might be different, but the kind of feeling that we grew up with. I think one of the striking things is, um, and I don't know if Sylvia would say it quite this way, but when she and her brothers have shared, when they were called names or when they were what we would call today bullied, their response was very much like what I was taught is that's not who you are, and you just walk away and you don't put up with that. You know, you don't engage in it for the girls. Now, the boys, just like my dad, the two sons would probably have a few fist fights in the
Mm.
midst of that. But luckily, no one was ever tragically hurt. Um, but we were kind of taught this is what you expect from others. And when this happens, you do not, you do not kind of don't let it define who you are. You know, this isn't
Talked about,
who
we
you are.
talked about the choices that we have when we experience racism or biases or prejudices. We can be victims,
Mhm.
or as we've talked about before, worthy of the suffering. And you maintain, as you say, your who you are, your own identity, and you keep your own self-respect, as
Mhm.
opposed to the alternative, which is to be a victim and to react in negative ways, as we have seen in some cases. Is that a cultural thing, do you think, between Hispanics and Asians, or is it part of family culture? What's your thought?
I don't think it's, I think there's a whole range in each culture of kind of the resilience to it or the trauma of it, really. And I think when you are discriminated against, there's always some sense of trauma. But I heard this first from a Holocaust survivor when I went to hear her speak at the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles. And she said her life was horrendous. I mean, she literally, as a young child, could have died 4 times in the Holocaust, in all the situations that she was put in. But she said, as a young woman, when she got married to another Holocaust survivor, she said, we had to make the decision if we're going to be survivors or victims.
Mm.
And she and her husband, at a young age, um, decided we're going to be survivors, and that's how they live their life. And even into this was a few years ago. She may have passed now, but um, she was in her mid to late 80s when I heard her speak. And I think even the fact that she's dedicated her much of her life to telling her story, her true story of what she encountered, is a survivor story. It's like, and she credited, somebody asked, how did you survive all of that? And she said, only by God's grace, only by God.
Mm.
And I think my faith is a big part of the resilience, is that I know I'm defined as a child of God, and people can call me names, they can have different perceptions, but I know who I am in God's light and his grace and mercy. And so for me, that is kind of my foundation. But I've spoken to people of all races where I do feel like, and this is not a blame thing, this is just the truth, where they're feeling more as a victim. And in some cases, I could totally see why. There's good reasons for that. So it's not a judgment at all. But I do think trying to make the decision to say we're going to be a survivor. And I now see that a lot in my dad and my grandfather's lives. I
Mm.
um, because of the lease arrangement that my dad made with Mr. Mendez through his mentor banker, Mr. Monroe. It was a legitimate lease. They were people of integrity and honesty. And so, because of that lease, our family was able to pay the property tax for the farm, which many Japanese Americans could not afford because there was no
Mhm.
income to pay.
Mhm.
And so even though my dad did have hardship in terms of having to sell a lot of things to keep that farm home, they were able to have a home to come home to. And in fact, my grandfather and my dad brought other Japanese American friends who did not have homes or a place to come home to. They brought them to live and work on the farm after the war and get
Wow.
kind of to help them get resettled.
Wow,
And yeah,
that,
and I think so they
that's such a wonderful testimony to helping each other, not just being selfish or taking care of your own, to really reaching out into the community. How did the community outside of the Japanese Americans, was there other community uh, outreach that assisted both families?
I think you'll find along the West Coast, you'll find stories of different Japanese American families who have a story. In fact, I was just talking to a friend from Japanese language school yesterday, and they had a family who oversaw their farm here in
Mhm.
Orange County. There are stories like that in Washington, I believe in Oregon, in different parts of California. So there were community people, whether they be white or Mexican, who said, you know, we're the next door neighbor farm. We'll take care of this while you're gone. Um, so that's the beautiful part of community. On the other hand, I've also heard stories where the farms, and this happened to many people, where the farms were lost because the property tax could not be paid, and or they put it under someone who was dishonest and had no integrity and did not give the farm back after the war. And so it's the whole spectrum, as you can imagine. And so while I think my dad and grandfather, when I speak, I often get asked the question, why didn't they have more resentment? And I said, oh, I'm sure they're human. They had resentment. But I think they had to choose to say, wait, we have a farm, we have a home, we have workers' cottages, um, and we can bring our friends to get settled. And it wasn't only our friends. Through writing this book, I had an email from an older woman whose husband had died, and she said, I read your book, and she said, my husband lived on that farm. He was 8 years old.
Wow.
He talked about that and the other kids. And this is a family, I have no idea who they are. So it to some degree, it wasn't just the friends that we know who lived on the farm. There were others who also were able to um, kind of get their feet on the ground. And sadly, this woman is a widow and her husband had already passed, but she says, I am sure when everything he talked about matches what you said in the book, where it was, who was there, and so I thought that was just kind of a lovely testament to community. I think too, the other thing is uh, there's um, there's sacrifice, you know, in this as well. Those who came and helped, they had to sacrifice something, even if it was their pride or their ego, um, something intangible. But the agreement that my dad made with Gonzalo was in the middle of a federal court case when our family was ready to come back in 1945. And for him to move off that land would have just there would be no case.
Mhm.
It was, even though there were five families, he was the lead plaintiff, and to move off that land would have defeated the potential of the case. And so my dad and grandfather decided that they would live on one of the four workers' cottages with my grandmother and my two aunts. Um, and Gonzalo could continue to lease the farm. He would continue to get the profits from that year's lease, just like the lease said. The only thing is he would now have my dad and my grandfather working for him. So it's a true one of those trading places where the owners of the farm are now working for the guy who's leasing the farm. Um,
There's irony in that, isn't there, Janice?
yeah, but I'm sure my dad and grandfather, after 3.5 years of not being on the farm and my grandfather being in a Department of Justice prison camp, they're like, anything, we'll get back. And so when they did that, there were 4 workers' cottages. And so those other 3 cottages were available to bring their friends back, which then did free Gonzalo Mendez up to spend probably almost full time on the case, but a lot, he didn't
Wow.
have to worry about the farm. He and his wife could fight the case while my dad and grandpa came home. And I'm sure I can just see them going, well, why are they doing it this way? That's not how we do it, and just kind of taking over. And one year, one of my dad's tax returns actually shows, at first I thought this was a mistake, but it shows lease funds from Gonzalo. And then it says daily wages from Gonzalo for that tax year. And I thought, I wonder if that was a mistake. But as I realized, as we got deeper into the story, my dad actually had worked more hours and daily wages than the amount of the lease. So,
Wow.
so it just kind of tells you that they're like, we're just glad to save the farm. And I'm sure after they heard stories of what other Japanese Americans had lost, their gratitude was even greater.
The word gratitude that you use reminds me of some of the uh, anecdotes in your book, which is kindness,
Mhm.
which of course relates to the title, The Kindness of Color, where kindness is remembering those who helped you with gratitude. And sprinkled throughout the book are these uh, comments about kindness. Can you speak a little bit about the inspiration behind how you planted those seeds? There's a saying which I've mentioned before, blessed are those that plant seeds for trees under whose shade they'll never sit.
Mm.
These are the kind of things that are so uplifting to me as a reader. What's the backstory behind these kindness inserts?
Well, I'll give you the backstory and the title, which leads to that.
Okay.
Sylvia and I had gotten asked to speak at a large corporate headquarters on the East Coast, and it was going to be brought or live streamed to their other units around the globe. And so this was a big deal. So Sylvia and I go. It was really cute. She'd never been at a corporate headquarters, so she was just in awe of the whole surroundings. And they served very nice appetizers at the reception. But so as we spoke, we realized that people wanted to know more about the people in the story, not just the case, not just the history. And it was really striking because Sylvia
Mm.
turned to me and she goes, they want to know about our families. And I'm like, yeah, I know. So we answered questions, but it got me thinking every time we start talking about the people, we talk about their actions and their attitudes. And then we talked about other people, the neighbors or the strangers or other friends who came alongside them. And the common denominator there was an act of kindness or the kindness of listening or the kindness of empathy. But I really saw that theme of kindness come out. And so one day, the friend who was helping me work on the book, he's like, okay, now we need a title because we're getting too far along to register it and all this stuff. So I'm like, okay, I don't know what to call it. It has to do something with kindness. And I actually, during the pandemic, went out and was walking every day. And I'm like, okay, Lord, I need a title, something with kindness. And as I'm walking, I just hear the kindness of color. And I'm,
Wow.
that's it. So I went with it. And as I then wrote in the book, I was talking to a woman who does a lot with different schools, and she knows a lot of school children. They have a ministry that ministers to school children, and so as I'm talking to her and telling her about what I'm writing about, she said, you know, the one thing she's seen is you cannot tell a child just be kind. They need to know what that looks like in action. You have to
mm,
describe it. This is what kindness is.
mm,
And I said, oh, that's interesting. So then I just started to put kindness is where all these different acts of kindness or compassion or empathy came up.
mm.
And I think I ended up with about 42 of them or so. I think it's over 40 of them in the book. And it's interesting because so many of my readers mention that. Oh, I loved when you wrote this. I loved. And so it became not even just for children, it became a reminder, I think, or inspiring people of all ages, readers of all ages, to look for those opportunities to be kind. I mean, I've talked to high school and college students where their whole book has more tabs in it than mine because they've put a little tab there where the kindness statements are. Um, and I think it reinforces kind of the genuine human goodness that God put in each of us to,
Absolutely.
to remember to be kind. This is what kindness looks like
Absolutely.
in a difficult situation, in a situation where, oh, I have to sacrifice my time, my talent, or my treasure, or, ooh, what does kindness look like? Because there's even one where my grandmother always told her kids, and us too, but she always said, be nice to Black people and Mexican people. And when I asked my aunt where she thinks that came from, she goes, she recalls her mother saying it came from when she was at the train station leaving to go into the camp. And we don't know. We don't even know if these men said anything to her. But the kindness of the Black and Mexican porters at the train station really touched my grandmother.
Wow.
We don't know if they gave her a hug. We don't know what they did. My dad and uncle were with her, so it wasn't like she had to carry things herself. But there was something that they did, and she didn't speak, especially back then, she didn't speak that much English, and definitely not Spanish. So we don't know what they did, but there was some
Well,
empathy,
the actions speak louder than words.
right? I mean, they could have just the way they looked at her, they could have hugged her. Who knows what they did? But I think that is something in our family that, yeah, that resonated. And I would say that it's interesting because I thought everyone did this, and so did my dad. Um, During Thanksgiving was the holiday, the big holiday when our workers, that when I grew up, they were all from Mexico. They were Mexican men. They lived on our farm like 10 to 11 months of the year. Under the Bracero program, and then they would go home at Christmas for a couple
Mhm,
of months and then return to work again.
mhm,
And they were like family. And so Thanksgiving for us was my dad and the workers would work in the morning, and then we'd always have Thanksgiving dinner at 1 o'clock so they could
mm.
go home, shower. And by that time, our food would be all ready. So I never knew people had Thanksgiving dinner at night. We were always like 1 o'clock people. And even though we have a small family, that table was all of our Mexican workers and Jesus and Socorro and Zubieta, and Jesus had two sons. So there was 5 or 6 of these workers that were full-time with us. And my grandma, grandpa, and our family. So it just never seemed, I mean, that's what we always did. And then one day my dad asked, hey, what do your friends eat at so and so's house, at the other farmer's house? I'm just curious, like, what do they serve for Thanksgiving? Kind of is just wondering what his buddies, the other farmers, were serving. And they got really quiet and they said their friends have never been in the boss's house.
Wow.
And that's when we went, oh, we didn't know that. We didn't know that. And so that was enlightening. And now that I think about it, when I was writing the book, I thought, um, I want to say every year, but nearly every year, probably every year, when they would come back after their winter time holiday with their families, they brought us gifts. And I had this little woven serape. Wish I still had it, but it would be too small. This little girl-sized serape. We had woven baskets. There are some things that I've saved. They gave my mom a silver sombrero brooch. pin. So I do have some of those things that they brought us as gifts. And well, oh, thank you. That's so nice. Well, now we realize that they realized that working, for my dad and grandpa was different than how they might have been treated at other farms. And so, um, yeah, we didn't know that.
Well, the contrast that you talk about, that they'd never been in their boss's house, but the words you used, kindness, great gratitude, thankfulness, thanksgiving, to me, all points to the foundation of what has given you and your family and the Mendez family resilience. There's brain chemistry involved with gratitude and thankfulness that is very uplifting. And I know that I do a gratitude post every day
Mhm.
because it's just so, I don't know, encouraging and positive as opposed to the negativity and the anxiety that we go through the world with. So I think
Mhm.
your book is really a testament to pointing people in that direction of kindness, because that is a choice that we make with strangers or friends and family, whether they love us or not. Um, love your enemies
Mhm.
mentality. So this is really enlightening when you talk about some of the experiences that you've had that relate to your family's internment and the whole issue on the Mendez family issues. What was important for you to emphasize these acts? How did you choose? There's so many, I would imagine. You said you had 42 examples of kindness in here. Is this something that you sat down and thought about, or did they just come up from your own experiences of dealing with your family and others?
They just popped up. I mean, Sylvia and I would be talking, and she goes, "Oh, and the story, this story, and that story." Uh, it was very organic. So I had no idea how many would come up, but I thought, well, as long as I have, a handful of these kindness statements, it'll make sense in the book. And then I got into it, and there's multiple ones. Um, I think, Henry Rivera is one of the ones I love the most. And I always, when I'm speaking to a group, I said, Henry is likely in heaven going, what is she doing talking about me again? He was a truck driver. And Sylvia's mother said that when they were in the midst of this issue with the school districts, Henry was a truck driver. He drove from the LA produce market to Orange County, every week, picked up produce and drove back. So someone that they saw every week, at least once, maybe more than once a week. And when he heard about what was going on with the school district, he said, there's an attorney named David Marcus in Los Angeles, and he's been fighting for the rights of Mexican families and Mexican people. Maybe you should call him. And I just love that story because Henry probably doesn't even remember telling Gonzalo that, or maybe he does, but he probably never thought it would be any big deal. But what did Henry do? He listened. He was thinking about Gonzalo, driving, no freeways back then, driving in his truck, thinking about, what are ways that someone could help Gonzalo, and not only Gonzalo, the other Mexican families too, but that's a story that Sylvia's mother recounts. Um, and she knows his name. It's Henry Rivera. I mean, there was no doubt.
Hmm.
It wasn't like, oh, what's his name? I mean, these were friends. So even that, he probably has no idea what that led to. Um, and even our family, my dad would be kind of shocked that I wrote a book about our family history related to this because what I knew was, oh yeah, that's the family that leased the farm during the war. Um,
The older generation, Janice, is usually so much more private. And how would your dad react to your book? Would he be, wow, Janice, great job? Or would he be a little embarrassed? Uh,
I
what would
think
he
he
say?
would be. Oh, I think he would be pleased. I think my mom is the one who'd be embarrassed. And so I hate to say this, but all of my relatives, except for my aunts and my uncle, um, have passed before I published the book.
Mm,
Um, and so, and my uncle doesn't play that big of a role because he didn't return to the farm. He got his education and became a surgeon. So he
mm.
didn't return to the farm after World War II. And my aunts were little girls. And so they're, yeah, go ahead, do whatever, Janice, they're they're not very they're not secretive or private like that.
Mhm.
And so but I think my dad would be in a way proud that his story, not for himself, but that this story has become so meaningful to so many people. I mean, I'm shocked. I have some Japanese American younger generations that said, my family won't talk about their time in the camps, and I've learned about my
Yes.
family through your book.
Mm,
Whoa, that was not my intention. And I do tell them, I said, there's going to be similarities. I said, but please ask your family for more details because not every story is this story. There's
mm.
125,000 different stories because that's how many people were incarcerated during World War II. But what an honor to at least get them some basic information of that they could ask their family about. There's one young man that I know from church who said, they won't talk about it or they don't talk about it. And I said, well, go and say, my friend at church wrote this book. Was this your, experience too? And I said, you might get them to talk when they see, oh, other people are talking about it.
Mhm.
I think too, we have to remember that Eastern cultures are shame-based cultures. And so
Mm.
depending on how you look at it, there was a lot of shame of being incarcerated, even though you were 100% innocent. And also a lot of how the camps were lacking in privacy, whether it be your living quarters, the showers had no shower privacy stalls. They had no privacy stalls for the toilets when they first got there. So there was a lot of very kind of indecent, inhumane conditions they were thrown in, which would even aggravate the shame-based culture of their Issei first generation parents. And so I don't blame them. It's not an easy thing to talk about. So without judgment, I mean, there are people who've never talked about it and people who've talked quite a bit about it. I thought most people were kind of in the talked about it somewhat. I don't think our family didn't talk about it all the time, but when they were talking to their friends, they'd say, oh, yeah, when we were in camp. I mean, Japanese American, at least in California, our culture is the timeline is before camp, during camp, after camp. That's how many of our families talk about their history. I'll say, oh, when did you meet them? Oh, that was before camp. Or when did you meet that friend? Oh, that was in camp. Oh, they came after camp. I mean, that's how the dialogue would go. So it wasn't as if it was stressed, but it showed up.
You talked about well, we know Executive Order 9066, and then there's the loyalty provision. I know in my own family's case, they were incarcerated. They were originally from Seattle, and
Mhm,
as I mentioned to you, they were incarcerated in Tule Lake, and they answered yes, yes. And to the loyalty question, and would you go into the military? And then Tule Lake was ultimately used as a camp for those that were no-nos.
mhm,
So there was an experience when my parents would be asked, what camp were you in, as you mentioned, and they
mhm,
said Tule Lake, and people would go, oh, which at the time there was a bias towards the yes yes people, but over time that perspective might have changed as
mhm.
to you know the attitudes towards the JACL and the whole thing. Have you experienced within your presentations any conversations about the yes yes versus the no no people?
It's come up sometimes. A lot of times when I'm talking to educators who know a lot more of history, they will ask, or groups with more Japanese Americans or people who know Japanese American history.
Mhm.
Um, My view on that is when you read those questions, they are so poorly written that if you said no, no, you're claiming something that wasn't true. And if you said yes, yes, you're claiming something that wasn't true. Because, 70% of these were American born citizens, and those
Mhm.
questions talk about your loyalty to Japan.
Mhm.
Well, I'm sorry, but none of them had loyalty to Japan. They'd never been there. And that was 70% of all who were incarcerated. And my grandfather, when he came to America, I mean, he never said this outright, but now that we think about it, even when I was uh, a kid, he had a picture of George Washington on the family room wall, the white-haired George Washington.
Wow.
He names his first son, my dad, his middle name is Lincoln,
Wow.
right? And my dad's birthday was the day after Abraham Lincoln's birthday, but they named him Lincoln. And my dad always said, it's a good thing they didn't go for February 14th because I could have ended up Seiko Valentine Munemitsu instead of Seiko Lincoln. So, I mean, at least in my grandfather's, in his actions, we can see how he really intended to make America his home.
Mhm. Mhm.
So when I think about those yes, yes questions, our family said yes, yes, because my dad, my mom, they didn't know each other at the time, but my mom was 18. She had her senior year of high school in the camp. My dad was 20, and my uncle was 19. My other aunt was 19. And so they all said yes, yes, because eventually they all took the indefinite leave and went. My dad was in Denver. My uncle was in the upper Midwest. My other aunt was in Ohio. They went to some get college, community college education. My uncle became a surgeon. My dad was working. So they said yes, yes. And I think part of it was the opportunity to
Mhm.
get
Get
indefinite
out.
leave and try to, do something productive with their because of their futures. They were young adults. Um, I do know people, and I've read stories of people who said no, no, and I could totally see it. I mean, I really credit them for reading this closely and saying, this is wrong. And it took a lot of courage, I think, to do that. And
Mhm.
so I respect both sides. I don't
Mhm.
know if I were in that position, just because our family does tend to be rule keepers. I think I would have said yes, yes to try to have other opportunities, educational or work opportunities. Um, but that's not to say that I don't have great respect for those who said no, no, and led the charge to show what injustice was done. Um,
I love your answer, Janice. I want to just delve a little bit in our time here, and I'm sensitive to our time, is your humility. In reading your background, graduate of USC, BS, MBA, and Biola University, MA, spiritual formation. You spent 20 years in a consumer packaged goods corporate career. Um, how did you make the transition from that Janice Munemitsu to the Janice Munemitsu of that wrote the book, The Kindness of Color?
well, I had about when my corporate career ended, in a very unique, only God could have orchestrated this way, I ended up uh, leading the capital campaign at my church. And I go
Mm,
to a large Southern California church. I go to Mariners Church, and
mm,
the Lord led me. I had no intention for this, but I had been laid off of my company because they were moving to the Midwest. And I thought, well, what am I going to do? And it wasn't a great job market. And God gave me a job that was supposed to last 9 months. It was a volunteer job, supposed to last 9 months. And I ended up leading that campaign for 10 years. And we built out a large campus here in Irvine, California for our church. Um, so that was kind of a 20, that plus other ministry. Um, roles was kind of I guess you could call it a transition. But, I think the one thing that's really
Sounds
interesting.
providential, Janice.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about it is I mentioned Dr. Mihalis and Jeff Hittenberger earlier, who really are the two who got me to write this book. And Jeff said, what's interesting, Janice? One of the ministries I worked for is called Generous Giving. And you can't give to Generous Giving, but they really help and have programs to help people understand biblical generosity, but you can't give to them.
Hmm.
So they could speak into this. And so I learned a lot about biblical generosity there. And Jeff was the first person who said to me, he goes, wow, think about that, the arc of that story. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He goes, about your grandfather's generosity. And now you're working in a ministry that promotes biblical generosity. And I'm like, oh, never thought about that. And then just maybe 2 years ago, a friend who was doing some research, it's someone I've met through the book, and he lives in Westminster, and he was going through the newspaper archives at the Westminster Museum, and he finds an article about my grandfather, and it's from 1940. And he said, what's interesting is in the little local newspaper, there aren't a lot of articles that talk about one person. He said it was unusual and it caught his eye because there weren't other articles like this. It wasn't a weekly thing or a monthly thing. And it says, Seimu Munemitsu truck farmer is well thought of here, is the title of it. And it goes down, and it's a fairly long article, and it talks about all these incidences where a woman who's a widow, or she and her children brought a few coins to ask if they could have some tomatoes. And my grandfather said, "Oh, no, no, just I don't have time to pick for you, but you just pick and take it." And so he was known in Westminster before the war as just letting people take vegetables.
Generosity.
Yeah, and it was generous. And I thought, well, I think a lot of farmers do that, but somehow Grandpa got noted in this article, right? Because from a farming standpoint, I think a lot of farmers do that. I mean, we know farmers who do that. But it was basically gleaning, letting them who didn't have or needed food to glean off the side of the farm.
Mm, mm.
And but I thought it was notable that that article out of, from 1940 would pop up about my
Wow.
father and his generosity. So I would like to say, I don't call myself generous. I say I'm learning to be more and more generous because no one can be as generous as our Father God. Um, but we can learn to move in that direction, right? More and more.
Let me just quote this because it's really relevant. 1 Timothy 6:17 to 19. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life.
Mm.
It sounds like that's how you were raised.
I'd like to say so. It's interesting that that scripture is one of the foundational scriptures for the organization of generous giving. Is
It's
that's that we would be more and more generous and learn to be generous as the Lord is
isn't
to us.
it a matter of who we trust, who we put our hope in?
Definitely, definitely. I I can't say that all the people in my book um, were believers. However, there are several key characters who were people of faith. And so I just, God works all things out for good. Not that he causes the adversity, but he works all things out for good, even though people do have to go through times of suffering and sacrifice. And so I think you could put a lot of scripture where I put those kindness statements, you could probably add a lot of scripture as well.
I'm aware of that in my own life. And I think there's a way that everybody has as to how they express their faith. I'm not one to beat people over the head with that sort of thing, and I sense the same subtlety in your presentation, that actions are more important than the words
Mm.
say. So I really appreciate that, and I think it's an important lesson for all of us to how we live our lives. How then shall we live? Which is another book, which is one of the things I want to ask you in our final moments together is, do you have any future books in your mind that you're cogitating or what?
A lot of people ask me that. I'm like, I'm still working on this one. I'm the reluctant author. However, I will say, through some friends who are in ministry, there's some stories that in the 10 to 20 years that I worked for Generous Giving and at Mariners Church, there's so many wonderful stories of God's generosity, His compassion, His grace that they're like, we should put those together. And I don't know if it's a book or it's a podcast, but there's stories of really how the Holy Spirit, when we trust Him, how He works in some, pretty incredible ways. So that's something I'm going to work on, because those stories also inspire people, particularly people who are already in ministry or working in churches, of how God can provide in so many different ways. So that's one thought. And you know what? Since I wrote this book, I do have some great stories. One of the main characters in the book is Frank Monroe, the
Mm,
bank,
hmm.
and he was my dad's friend. My dad would say his best friend who wasn't prejudiced at all. He hadn't a prejudiced bone in his body. And just last year, with the help of some others, we found his grandkids
Oh, wow.
who
Oh,
did
great.
not know this story of
Mm,
how Frank was connected with the Mendez et al. Versus Westminster case. And so that's been fun to get to know them, to hear their stories. And so there's a lot of kind of stories that are bubbling up from this story. And I don't know if it's a book. I've been blogging on them. So if people are interested, they can read more on my blog. I don't know if there's enough for a book, but there's certainly, I guess the story continues, right? This is a true story. And we learn more and more about the people in the story and what happened. I've had people, I mentioned the one man who his wife said when he was a little boy after camp, he lived on your farm, you know. I've had another lady who's a librarian at Santa Ana Library. She said, my dad worked for your dad.
mm.
And I met her mother, and there's a story there. And so I've been blogging about all these. And so maybe, the blogs become a book of short stories of what happened after. But there's a few of them. And it's really fun to see, history happened here. I think that's the one thing I never knew the power of that. Many teachers that I talk to or law enforcement, speak to a law enforcement program for the state of California, um, and they all say, we didn't know this happened here. It's one thing when you hear about parts of history that happened over there, over there,
Mhm.
over there. But when I say Beach Boulevard in Westminster, California, they're like, I know Beach Boulevard, or when you talk about local area things, they're amazed. And I said, this is why we need to know what history happened right here.
Absolutely.
And I think it really encourages people that they're seen, they're heard, they can make a difference, whatever that is in their own sphere of influence.
And the
Um,
perspective that you and the way that you present your story is so I don't know what the word is, but it's just such a um, appropriate. That's not even the right word. I'm struggling for the word that uh, kind of sums up the way the kindness of color impacted me. It was a very uplifting. It's a paradox in a way because the reality of bias and prejudices is not a pretty thing, but the hope that it gives is the paradox that's incorporated for me in the kindness of color. So I just want to thank you very much, Janice, for your time and inspiring nature of the person that you are. That I would love to continue our conversation in person, perhaps. But I'm going to call this to a pause and we'll continue talking.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ron.